sin.
This demon was stronger, more in control. Something like I've never seen before.
We are talking Proof of the Devil, which is a 2015 found footage movie, also known as The Butcher of Louisiana, also known as, I've got it, the Exorcism tapes. Not to be confused with the Exorcist tapes, which is an entirely different found footage movie. So, this is a 2015 possession movie, and the story is as follows. We have this setup where this documentary film crew are following around this mother whose son was convicted of multiple murders and was sentenced to death, and he's been executed. But she is convinced her son was actually possessed, and this is the reason why he went on this murderous rampage. And to prove it, she is going to try and summon the same demon to her to prove that her son was innocent. So we have this documentary film crew kind of following her around. Along with that, you've got a psychiatrist and a nurse that's working for the psychiatrist also there, along with a priest who kind of turns up here and there as well. Now, there's a lot of internal conflict between these parties. The psychiatrist thinks she's clearly mentally ill. She thinks the documentary filmmakers are trying to incite something to happen, to be salacious, things like this. So there's conflict within the group. Now, what will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss. Now, this is relatively low rated on the majority of reviews I have seen. So this is a low budget movie. And yes, it is somewhat typical of a possession style found footage movie, but I do think, I have to say, I quite like the idea. I think the idea is actually a relatively solid idea for a found footage movie. So the mother has invited this documentary film crew there to document it, to prove that there is this demon that has possessed her son and then ultimately her. And that is why this crew is there. That is why they are filming all the time. So it kind of gives them a reason to be there, and a reason why she's so candid with sharing everything. So I thought that was quite a good sort of setup. I also think the story in its concept is quite interesting. I think that's quite a neat idea for a setup for a possession movie. Someone who is actively trying to be possessed. And at first it doesn't go so well. She's trying to do it unsuccessfully initially. So it's not as if she came possessed like really easily. It takes a few attempts and a little try here. And it's quite believable, the conflict, I think, between the parties. The priest, who she feels that she doesn't want him there because ultimately she wants to be possessed. The psychiatrist, who's convinced that basically she's losing it and ultimately is very vulnerable, and the documentary filmmakers who are ultimately trying to exploit her. So again, I found that set up fairly interesting. I would say the acting is not terrible, but I would say that might sound like a very backhanded compliment, but I do think there's one or two performances that I would say do elevate it a little bit. Particularly the doctor, the psychiatrist who is there, I actually think does quite a good job and comes across like he's would be a professional kind of medical expert. So I actually thought his acting in particular stood out as actually being solid. And there's a couple of other ones who I certainly don't think were bad either. As you would expect, we do get a possession in the movie, and ultimately things don't go quite to plan, and maybe everyone got a little bit more than they had wished for, so to speak. So it gets a lot more tense as the film sort of goes on. And there's a reasonable body count in this movie for a possession film. I find with possession films, a lot of it is ultimately it's the psychology and all of that. But this one, there's this this causes people to get killed. So there is actually a kind of a body count in this film. You know, so it's I think it's a fair film in some ways. Now, on the other side of this, what does not work? I mean, the film ultimately is kind of a generic found footage film. You know, there's plenty of possession movies at this point. There's probably plenty of possession found footage movies that are actually better than this. Obviously, like The Last Exorcism springs to mind and things like that, and that's obviously what it's going to be compared to. And the low budgetness of this movie does show through. In particular, when we actually have the full-on possession. I would actually argue the movie gets worse as it goes along when the woman becomes fully possessed, and that's when it gets a little more silly. I think the makeup isn't particularly strong on her. It just looks like a woman in makeup. They've used like a kind of modulated like computer voice to kind of give her this effect of being possessed, but it sounds like it's coming through a computer rather than a sort of guttural growl or anything like that. And quite frankly, you can't really understand what she's saying because the voice is so distorted. It's hard to understand what the actual dialogue is at this point. So I didn't think the actual possession scenes were all that thrilling. It was more of the idea of it, I think, was actually the best thing here. I have to say, as I mentioned, the acting is mixed, but I've had to say if there was a weaker actor here, it was probably the mum, if I'm honest, because I think her performance, whilst I wouldn't say it was out and out terrible, if I'm honest, it was below average, but not terrible. But nonetheless, she's such a central figure to the movie. I feel the acting here is kind of brought down by the fact that she is really the kind of the main character of this movie, and her performance was lackluster at sort of best, to be honest with you. Ultimately, I think it gets, as I say, sillier as the movie progresses, and by the end, I think it kind of really does lose a little bit of credibility and gets maybe a little bit too silly for its own good. I actually think it could have pulled back a bit. Yes, I've mentioned there's quite a high body count in this movie for a possession movie, but at the same time, I feel it ended up being sillier because of that, because the consequences that led from this were seemingly that no one really knew what was going on. Everyone thought it was a hoax, things like this. And it's just like, well, I don't know. So, yeah, I think the concept of this movie is stronger than the execution, but I don't think the execution is terrible. This is like a watchable found footage movie. I think it ends up falling into some of the tropes that found footage tends to fall for. But it's not bad. It just gets a little bit generic, a little bit lackluster. I'll give it a 4 out of 10, but it's not as bad as maybe some people would have told you. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Please do let me know what your thoughts are, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.